The deputy sheriff's cruiser pulled into my driveway at exactly 10:37 in the morning, kicking up a cloud of dust that hung in the crisp autumn air like a question mark. I watched from my kitchen window as Deputy Martinez stepped out, adjusting his hat and walking toward my front gate with the measured stride of someone who'd rather be anywhere else. Little did he know that this complaint call would become the most awkward conversation of his career, especially when he realized who was signing his department's paychecks. As I opened the gate to meet him, one thought crossed my mind. How do you explain jurisdiction to someone who forgot they work for you? Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button so you don't miss any more epic Karen stories, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. My name is Caleb Morrison, and I've lived on these 43 acres of rolling pasture land outside Millbrook County for the better part of 15 years. What started as a dream to give my family space to breathe had turned into something of a battleground, thanks to the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association that had sprouted up around us like weeds after a summer rain. When I first bought this property, it was nothing but farmland and freedom. Now, somehow, I found myself surrounded by cookie-cutter developments and people who thought rural living meant perfectly manicured lawns and silent Saturday mornings. The irony wasn't lost on me that as the elected county commissioner for District 3, I spent most of my weekdays dealing with zoning disputes, land use permits, and property rights issues. Yet here I was, standing in my own driveway, about to face the consequences of my sons doing exactly what country kids have done for generations, riding their ATVs across open land that belonged to their family. My boys, 16-year-old Jake and 14-year-old Cotter, had been riding those machines since they were tall enough to reach the handlebars properly. Every Saturday and Sunday morning, they'd fire up their Yamaha Grizzlies and head out to the back pasture, following the same trails they'd worn into the earth over the years. The sound of those engines warming up had become as much a part of our weekend routine as my wife Sarah's pancakes and the smell of coffee brewing in the kitchen. This particular morning had started like any other. Sarah was visiting her sister in Nashville for the weekend, leaving me to handle the domestic logistics of teenage boys and their mechanical pursuits. I'd been reviewing budget proposals for the upcoming county commission meeting when the familiar rumble of the ATVs starting up drifted through the windows. Jake and Connor had bolted down their breakfast, grabbed their helmets, and disappeared toward the equipment shed with the kind of purpose that only comes from pure anticipation. I'd smiled to myself, remembering my own teenage years spent on my grandfather's farm, where the only noise ordinances were the ones imposed by roosters and the dinner bell. There's something fundamentally American about the sound of young people exploring their own land, learning responsibility through the maintenance of machines, and developing the kind of spatial awareness that only comes from navigating real terrain at speed. That's when I heard it, the unmistakable whine of an engine being pushed beyond its comfort zone, followed by the kind of whooping and hollering that meant one of my sons had just cleared a jump or taken a turn faster than physics generally recommended. The boys had been working on a new section of trail that wound through the oak grove at the far end of our property, where the land rose and fell in gentle hills perfect for the kind of recreational riding that builds character and burns energy. 20 minutes later, the sound of the ATVs had faded into the distance as Jake and Connor explored the outer boundaries of our land. I'd returned to my paperwork, calculating the costs of repaving County Road 12 and reviewing the environmental impact study for the proposed grain elevator expansion, when I noticed the sheriff's cruiser turning into my driveway. Deputy Martinez was someone I knew professionally, but not personally. He'd been with the sheriff's department for about 3 years, transferred from the city after deciding he preferred rural law enforcement to urban crime fighting. He was competent, respectful, and generally well regarded by the community, which made this situation all the more delicate. "Morning, Commissioner," he said as I approached the gate, his tone carrying that careful neutrality that police officers perfect when they're not entirely sure what they're walking into. "Morning, Deputy. What brings you out this way?" I kept my voice equally neutral, though I had a pretty good idea what this was about. He pulled out a small notebook and flipped it open with practiced efficiency. "I received a complaint about noise violations and possible trespassing involving off-road vehicles on this property. The caller reported that 2 individuals on ATVs were creating excessive noise and potentially endangering public safety." I leaned against the gatepost, studying Martinez's face. He was doing his job, following up on a complaint as he was required to do, but there was something in his expression that suggested he wasn't entirely comfortable with the situation. Who made the complaint? A Mrs. Brenda Hutchinson, president of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. She indicated that this has been an ongoing issue and that previous attempts to resolve it through community channels have been unsuccessful. The mention of Brenda Hutchinson's name brought everything into sharp focus. Brenda was what people politely called a community activist, and what everyone else called a professional busybody. She'd moved to Whispering Pines about 2 years ago from somewhere up north, bringing with her a very specific vision of what suburban life should look like. Unfortunately for everyone involved, her vision didn't include the realities of rural living that had existed in this area for generations. "Deputy, can I ask you something?" I kept my voice conversational, almost casual. "Sure, Commissioner. Are you familiar with the jurisdiction boundaries for noise ordinances in unincorporated areas of the county?" Martinez paused, his pen hovering over his notebook. "Well, sir, noise ordinances generally apply county-wide, though there are specific provisions for rural and agricultural areas." "That's right. And who has authority over those ordinances?" "The County Commission has primary authority over ordinances in unincorporated areas, though the Sheriff's Department is responsible for enforcement when complaints are filed." I nodded slowly, watching as understanding began to dawn in his eyes. "And just to clarify, you did recognize my name when Mrs. Hutchinson filed her complaint?" Deputy Martinez closed his notebook and let out a slow breath. "Commissioner Morrison, I have to admit, when I took this call, I was focused on the complaint itself, rather than, well, the broader context. The broader context being that you're standing on private property, investigating a complaint about legal recreational activity, filed by someone who doesn't actually have standing to dictate what happens on land she doesn't own or have any authority over." The deputy shifted uncomfortably, and I could see him running through the legal and political implications of his situation. As a county commissioner, I wasn't technically his boss. That would be Sheriff Patterson. But the county commission controlled the sheriff's department budget, determined staffing levels, and had significant influence over departmental policies and procedures. "Sir, I still need to document the complaint and file a report, but I'm beginning to see that this might be more complicated than Mrs. Hutchinson suggested." Just then, the sound of the ATVs returning echoed across the pasture. Jake and Connor were making their way back toward the house, following the established trail that kept them well within our property boundaries. The engines were running at normal speeds, not the aggressive acceleration that might constitute excessive noise, and both boys were wearing proper safety equipment. "Those are my sons," I said, pointing toward the approaching riders. "Jake and Connor. They've been riding these trails every weekend for the past 3 years. The land they're riding on has been in my family for 15 years. And before that, it was agricultural land where machinery operated during planting and harvest seasons that made a lot more noise than a couple of recreational ATVs." Deputy Martinez watched as the boys pulled up near the equipment shed, turned off their machines, and began the post-ride routine of checking air filters and cleaning mud from the wheels. "They seem to know what they're doing." "They do. Both boys completed ATV safety courses through the State Parks Department. They maintain their own machines. They follow established trails to minimize environmental impact, and they wear proper safety equipment. Most importantly, they're doing all of this on private property that their family owns." The deputy made a few notes, then looked up with the expression of someone who was beginning to understand that he'd walked into the middle of a much larger conflict. "Commissioner, can you help me understand the history here? Mrs. Hutchinson seemed pretty adamant that this was a serious community issue." I gestured toward the house. "Would you like some coffee? This might take a few minutes to explain properly." We walked toward the back porch, where I kept a small table and chairs for exactly these kinds of conversations. Rural politics often worked better over coffee than in formal meeting rooms, and I had a feeling this situation was going to require some careful navigation. The short version is that Mrs. Hutchinson moved here with certain expectations about what country living would be like, I began, pouring coffee from the thermos I brought out earlier. She seems to believe that rural areas should operate under the same rules as suburban neighborhoods, which creates conflict with people who've been living here for decades. Deputy Martinez accepted the coffee gratefully. What kind of conflicts? Well, she's filed complaints about my neighbor's rooster, claiming it violates noise ordinances. She's objected to the farmer across the road spreading manure during planting season. She's tried to get the county to enforce subdivision-style architectural standards on properties that existed long before her development was even planned. And now she's going after my boys for riding ATVs on their own family's land. I see. Martinez was taking notes again, but I could tell he was also processing the political implications of what I was telling him. Here's what bothers me most about this situation, I continued, settling into my chair and taking a sip of coffee. Mrs. Hutchinson isn't just filing complaints. She's trying to use the sheriff's department as her personal enforcement arm for rules that don't actually exist. That puts you and your colleagues in impossible positions. And it wastes county resources that should be focused on actual law enforcement priorities. End quote. The deputy nodded slowly. Commissioner, I have to ask, are there any actual ordinances that would apply to this situation? That's the right question. County Ordinance 7-12 addresses noise in unincorporated areas. It specifically exempts agricultural activities, recreational activities on private property during daylight hours, and activities that don't exceed certain decibel levels measured at property boundaries. My boy's ATV riding falls under at least 2 of those exemptions. So Mrs. Hutchinson's complaint doesn't have legal basis? Not only does it not have legal basis, but her attempt to use HOA authority to regulate activity on non-HOA property is actually a violation of state law regarding the scope of ESC. Homeowners Association powers. Deputy Martinez finished his coffee and closed his notebook. Commissioner, I appreciate you taking the time to explain this. I have to complete my report, but it's going to reflect that no violation occurred and that the complaint appears to be based on a misunderstanding of applicable ordinances. I appreciate that, Deputy, but I think we need to address the bigger issue here. What do you mean? I stood up and walked to the edge of the porch, looking out over the pasture where Jake and Connor were now working on their machines. Mrs. Hutchinson isn't going to stop with this complaint. She's going to escalate, file more complaints, maybe try to get other residents involved. Eventually, this is going to become a bigger problem that requires more of everyone's time and energy. Do you have a suggestion for how to handle that? Actually, I do, but it's going to require some coordination between the sheriff's department, the county commission, and the community. Deputy Martinez joined me at the porch railing. I'm listening. First, I think Sheriff Patterson needs to have a conversation with Mrs. Hutchinson about appropriate use of emergency services and complaint procedures. Filing false or frivolous complaints isn't just annoying. It's actually a misdemeanor under state law. That makes sense. Second, I think the county needs to clarify its ordinances regarding rural property use and recreational activities. A lot of these conflicts stem from people not understanding what rules actually apply in unincorporated areas. Would that be something the county commission would address? Exactly. And third, I think we need to have a community meeting to discuss the differences between HOA authority and county jurisdiction. Too many people seem to think that homeowners associations have some kind of governmental power, which they don't. Deputy Martinez was nodding as I spoke. Those all sound like reasonable approaches. Do you think Mrs. Hutchinson would be receptive to that kind of clarification? Honestly, probably not. But I think the rest of the community would benefit from understanding their rights and responsibilities. Just then, Jake and Connor walked over from the equipment shed, having finished their post-ride maintenance. Both boys were still wearing their helmets and safety gear, and both had the kind of satisfied exhaustion that comes from spending a morning doing something physically demanding and fun. Dad, we heard there was a sheriff's car, Jake said, pulling off his helmet and running a hand through his sweat-dampened hair. Everything okay? Connor added, his 14-year-old voice carrying just a hint of the anxiety that comes from wondering if you've somehow gotten into trouble without knowing it. Everything's fine, boys. Deputy Martinez just needed to follow up on a complaint, but we've sorted it out. Deputy Martinez stepped forward and extended his hand to each of the boys. You guys seem pretty skilled on those machines. Thank you, sir, Jake replied, shaking the deputy's hand with the kind of firm grip I'd been teaching both boys since they were old enough to understand that handshakes mattered. We've been riding for about 4 years now, Connor added. Dad made us take safety courses before he'd let us ride without supervision. That's smart, Martinez said, looking impressed. Most of the ATV accidents we respond to involve people who don't know what they're doing or aren't wearing proper safety equipment. Dad always says that freedom comes with responsibility, Jake said, echoing one of my favorite phrases. If we want to keep riding, we have to prove we can do it safely. Good philosophy, the deputy agreed, then turned back to me. Commissioner, I think I have everything I need for my report. Is there anything else you'd like me to include? Just document that the activity was legal, occurred on private property, involved proper safety equipment and procedures, and that the complaint appears to have been filed based on a misunderstanding of applicable BOBAD laws and ordinances. Will do. Martinez shook hands with all of us again, then walked back toward his cruiser. As he was getting into his car, I called out, Deputy, one more thing. Yes, sir? When you talk to Sheriff Patterson about this, let him know I'd like to set up a meeting to discuss some broader community relations issues. I think there are some opportunities for better communication between the department and residents in unincorporated areas. I'll make sure he gets that message. After Deputy Martinez left, I sent the boys inside to get cleaned up while I sat on the porch and thought about the morning's events. In one sense, this had been a minor incident, the kind of neighbor dispute that rural communities deal with regularly. But, in another sense, it represented something more significant about the changing dynamics of our area and the challenges that came with growth and development. 20 minutes later, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Sheriff Patterson's office number. Hello, Sheriff. Caleb, I just got Deputy Martinez's report about the complaint at your property. I wanted to call and apologize for any inconvenience. No need to apologize, Bill. Your deputy handled the situation professionally. But I do think we need to talk about some broader issues. Martinez mentioned you wanted to set up a meeting. What's on your tane? Mind? I walked inside and settled into my home office, where I kept files related to my county commission work. We're seeing an increase in complaint calls from residents who don't understand the difference between HOA rules and county ordinances. It's creating unnecessary work for your department and confusion in the INS community. I've noticed that trend too. What do you think we should do about it? I have a few ideas, but they'll require coordination between your department, the county commission, and maybe the county attorney's office. I'm listening. First, I think we need to develop some educational materials about rural property rights and applicable ordinances. Too many people are moving here from urban areas with different expectations about noise, land use, and community standards. That makes sense. What else? Second, I think your department needs a clear policy about handling complaints that don't have legal basis. Right now, deputies are spending time and resources investigating activities that are perfectly legal, which isn't efficient for anyone. Sheriff Patterson was quiet for a moment. Are you suggesting we should screen complaints more carefully before dispatching officers? I'm suggesting we should train dispatchers to ask better questions and provide deputies with clearer guidance about when they have discretion to handle complaints with phone calls rather than site visits. Okay, that's reasonable. What's your third idea? Community education. I think we should hold some public meetings to explain the differences between HOA authority and county jurisdiction. A lot of conflicts could be prevented if people understood what rules actually apply to their situations. Would you be willing to participate in those meetings? Absolutely. As county commissioner, I think it's part of my responsibility to help residents understand local government and their rights under county ordinances. All right, Caleb. Let me think about this and talk to some people. Can we meet early next week to discuss specifics? Tuesday afternoon works for me. My office or yours? Let's meet at the county building. I'll bring Deputy Martinez and maybe our legal advisor. after I hung up with Sheriff Patterson, I spent the rest of the morning researching precedents for the kind of community education program I had in mind. It turned out that several rural counties in our state had dealt with similar issues as suburban development expanded into traditionally agricultural areas. The key was finding ways to preserve the rights of existing residents while helping newcomers understand and adapt to rural community standards. It wasn't about excluding people or resisting change. It was about maintaining the balance that made rural living attractive in the first place. That afternoon, I decided to take a walk around our property to see it from the perspective of someone like Mrs. Hutchinson. Our 43 acres included the main house, a large equipment shed, a barn that we used for storage, and about 35 acres of pasture and woodland. The ATV trails that Jake and Connor used were barely visible unless you knew where to look, and they followed natural contours that minimized erosion and avoided sensitive areas near the creek. Standing at the back edge of our property, I could see the Whispering Pines development in the distance. The houses were attractive enough, built in that generic suburban style that could have been anywhere in America. Each one sat on about an acre of perfectly maintained lawn, with professionally landscaped gardens and driveways that looked like they were pressure-washed weekly. It wasn't hard to understand why someone moving from that environment might find the sights and sounds of rural life jarring. Roosters crowing at dawn, tractors operating during planting and harvest seasons, and teenagers riding ATVs on weekend mornings probably seemed chaotic compared to the predictable quiet of suburban neighborhoods. But that's exactly why I'd moved out here in the first place. I wanted my sons to grow up understanding that food came from farms, that machinery required maintenance, and that freedom meant taking responsibility for your own land and your own choices. Those lessons couldn't be learned in subdivisions, where every activity was regulated by committees and every sound was subject to neighborhood approval. As I walked back toward the house, I could hear Jake and Connor in the equipment shed, doing something that involved periodic bursts of compressed air and occasional creative language when parts didn't cooperate. They were learning valuable skills about mechanical systems, problem solving, and the satisfaction that comes from maintaining your own equipment. More importantly, they were learning those lessons in an environment where mistakes had natural consequences rather than bureaucratic ones. If they didn't maintain their ATVs properly, the machines wouldn't run reliably. If they rode recklessly, they'd crash and potentially get hurt. If they damaged property or bothered neighbors, they have to face those consequences directly rather than hiding behind parents or lawyers. That evening, I called my wife Sarah to update her on the day's events. "So let me understand this," she said after I'd explained the morning's visit from Deputy Martinez. "Brenda Hutchinson called the sheriff's department to complain about Jake and Connor riding ATVs on our own property?" "That's exactly what happened. And she didn't know that you're a county commissioner? Apparently?" "Not." Sarah was quiet for a moment, then started laughing. "Oh, Caleb, I wish I could have seen that deputy's face when he realized what was happening. To his credit, he handled it professionally, but I think it opened his eyes to some of the broader issues we're dealing with." "What kind of broader issues?" I explained my conversation with Sheriff Patterson and the plans we were developing for community education and policy clarification. "Do you think Mrs. Hutchinson is going to back down?" Sarah asked. "Honestly, no, I don't. I think she's going to escalate, which is why we need to get ahead of this with clear policies and community education." "What do you mean escalate?" "I think she's going to try to rally other HOA residents, maybe file more complaints, possibly even try to get media attention or contact state officials." "Can she do that?" "She can try, but it won't change the legal reality. County ordinances are county ordinances, and property rights are property rights. But she can certainly make everyone's life more complicated in the process." As it turned out, my prediction was accurate. The following Monday morning, I arrived at my county commission office to find 3 messages on my voicemail, all from residents of Whispering Pines, all complaining about noise and safety issues related to off-road vehicles in the area. The first message was from Mrs. Hutchinson herself, demanding that I recuse myself from any decisions related to ATV regulations due to my obvious conflict of interest. The second was from someone named Robert Chen, who claimed that ATV noise was disrupting his home office and affecting his productivity. The third was from a woman named Patricia Williams, who expressed concerns about ATVs potentially causing accidents on rural roads. I listened to all three messages twice, taking notes and trying to separate legitimate concerns from manufactured outrage. Robert Chin's complaint about noise might have some merit if ATVs were operating near his property during inappropriate hours or at excessive volume levels. Patricia Williams' safety concerns could be valid if ATVs were being operated on public roads without proper licensing and safety equipment. But Mrs. Hutchinson's demand that I recuse myself revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of how local government worked. As an elected official, I had a responsibility to represent all constituents in my district, but I also had every right to own property and engage in legal activities on that property. There was no conflict of interest in defending property rights that applied equally to all residents. I spent the morning researching similar cases in other counties and consulting with the county attorney about the legal parameters of the situation. By lunchtime, I had a clearer picture of both our rights and our options. The county attorney, Margaret Yates, was particularly helpful in clarifying the scope of HOA authority. Homeowners associations have very limited power, she explained during our phone conversation. They can enforce covenants and restrictions that property owners agreed to when they purchased homes within the association, but they have no authority over properties that aren't part of the association. What about noise? Ordinances? I asked. County noise ordinances apply throughout unincorporated areas, but they include specific exemptions for agricultural activities, recreational activities on private property during daylight hours, and activities that don't exceed specified decibel levels. Someone would have to prove that ATV riding violates those standards, which would require actual sound measurements taken at property boundaries. Has anyone actually measured sound levels? Not according to any complaints filed with the Sheriff's Department. All the complaints I've seen are based on subjective assessments rather than objective measurements. What about the suggestion that I should recuse myself from ATV-related decisions? Margaret laughed. That's not how recusal works. You'd only need to recuse yourself if you had a financial interest that differed from other property owners, or if you were personally named in legal proceedings. Owning property and exercising normal property rights doesn't create a conflict of interest. So I can participate in discussions about updating ordinances or clarifying existing policies? Not only can you participate, you probably should participate. You represent constituents who are affected by these issues, and you have direct experience with the practical implications of current policies. That afternoon, I met with Sheriff Patterson and Deputy Martinez to discuss our community education plan. We agreed on several key points that would help prevent future conflicts. First, the Sheriff's Department would develop a standardized process for handling noise complaints that included requirements for objective measurements, documentation of specific ordinance violations. Too many complaints were currently based on subjective annoyance rather than actual legal violations. Second, we would create educational materials explaining the differences between HOA authority and county jurisdiction, with specific examples of activities that were regulated by each type of organization. These materials would be available at the county building, the sheriff's office, and online. Third, we would hold a series of community meetings in different areas of the county to discuss rural property rights, recreational vehicle regulations, and neighbor relations. These meetings would include representatives from the county commission, the sheriff's department, and the county attorney's office. I think the key is education rather than enforcement, Sheriff Patterson said as we wrapped up our meeting. Most of these conflicts stem from misunderstandings rather than deliberate violations. I agree, I replied. But we also need to make it clear that frivolous complaints waste county resources and may have legal consequences. What kind of legal consequences? Deputy Martinez asked. Filing false reports is a misdemeanor, I explained, and using emergency services for non-emergency situations can result in fines and penalties. Are you suggesting we should prosecute people for complaining? I'm suggesting we should prosecute people for knowingly filing false complaints or abusing emergency services. There's a difference between good faith concerns about potential violations and deliberate harassment disguised as law enforcement requests. As we finalized our plans, I couldn't help but think about the broader implications of what we were dealing with. Rural communities across the country were facing similar challenges as suburban development expanded into traditionally agricultural areas. The conflicts weren't just about noise or property rights. They were about fundamentally different visions of what community life should look like. Some people moved to rural areas seeking the peace and quiet of suburban neighborhoods with more space. Others moved there seeking the freedom and independence of traditional country living. When those different expectations collided, the result was exactly the kind of situation we were now trying to resolve. The following Saturday morning, Jake and Cotter were preparing for their usual ATV ride when I noticed a small group of people gathering at the edge of the Whispering Pines development. About a quarter mile from our property boundary, they appeared to be taking photographs and making notes, which suggested that Mrs. Hutchinson had escalated her campaign as I'd predicted. "Boise, I want you to be extra careful today," I told Jake and Connor as they checked their equipment. "Stay on our established trails, keep your speed reasonable, and make sure you're back by noon." "Is there a problem, Dad?" Jake asked, noticing the group of people in the distance. "Just some neighbors who don't understand property rights," I replied. "Nothing you need to worry about, but I want to make sure we don't give them any legitimate complaints." "Are they going to try to stop us from riding?" Connor asked, a note of concern in his voice. "They can't stop you from riding on our own property, son. But they might try to cause trouble if they think you're doing anything unsafe or inconsiderate." Both boys nodded seriously, understanding that this was about more than just their weekend recreation. They were representing our family and our values, and they needed to conduct themselves accordingly. As they rode off toward the back pasture, I kept an eye on the group at the development boundary. Sure enough, as soon as the sound of the ATVs became audible, several people began pointing and taking what appeared to be video recordings with their phones. I decided this was a good opportunity to have a direct conversation with Mrs. Hutchinson and her supporters. I walked across the pasture toward the property line, taking my time and trying to appear as non-threatening as possible. "Good morning," I called out as I approached the group. "I'm Caleb Morrison, and I believe you folks have some concerns about my son's riding ATVs on our property." Mrs. Hutchinson stepped forward, holding her phone in what was clearly a recording position. "Mr. Morrison, we're documenting ongoing noise violations and safety hazards created by unregulated off-road vehicle activity in this area." "I see. Have you measured actual sound levels to determine whether any noise ordinances are being violated? We don't need sound meters to know when we're being disturbed by excessive noise." "Actually, Mrs. Hutchinson, you do need objective measurements to file valid noise complaints. County ordinances specify exact decibel limits measured at property boundaries." A man I didn't recognize stepped forward. "Are you saying we don't have the right to peaceful enjoyment of our own property?" "Not at all. I'm saying you have the right to peaceful enjoyment of your property, and I have the right to legal recreational use of my property. The question is whether my son's ATV riding actually violates any applicable ordinances." "It's obviously excessive," Mrs. Hutchinson insisted. "Based on what standard?" "Have you consulted County Ordinance 7-12 regarding noise in unincorporated areas? Are you familiar with the exemptions for recreational activities on private property during daylight hours?" The group exchanged glances, and I could tell that none of them had actually researched the legal framework they were claiming to enforce. "We shouldn't have to become legal experts to live peacefully in our own homes," the unidentified man said. "You're absolutely right," I agreed. "But you also shouldn't assume that activities you find annoying are automatically illegal. That's why we have objective standards rather than subjective preferences." "Who are you to lecture us about legal standards?" Mrs. Hutchinson demanded. "I'm Caleb Morrison, elected County Commissioner for District 3. I represent this area in county government, and part of my job is helping residents understand local ordinances and their rights under those ordinances." The effect of this revelation was immediate and dramatic. Mrs. Hutchinson's mouth dropped open, the man with her took a step backward, and several other people in the group began talking at once. "You're the county commissioner?" Mrs. Hutchinson managed. "I am. And I have to tell you, Mrs. Hutchinson, that your approach to this situation is problematic on several levels. What do you mean? First, you're trying to enforce rules that don't exist. HOA covenants don't apply to properties outside your association, and you have no authority to regulate legal activities on other people's land. We have the right to complain about violations of county ordinances. You have the right to file complaints about actual violations based on objective evidence. You don't have the right to file false complaints or harass your neighbors because you don't like legal activities. The group was getting visibly uncomfortable, and I could see that several people were reconsidering their participation in Mrs. Hutchinson's campaign. "Are you threatening us?" she asked. "Not at all. I'm explaining your rights and responsibilities under county ordinances and state law. Filing false reports is a misdemeanor, and abusing emergency services can result in fines and penalties." Just then, the sound of the ATVs returning echoed across the pasture. Jake and Connor were heading back toward the house right on schedule, following their established trail and operating their machines at reasonable speeds. "Those are my sons," I said, pointing toward the approaching riders. "They're both certified through state ATV safety programs. They maintain their own equipment. They follow established trails to minimize environmental impact, and they operate only on our family's private TAN property during permitted hours." As the boys passed by, both of them waved politely to the group of observers. They were wearing proper safety equipment, riding at controlled speeds, and clearly demonstrating the kind of responsible behavior that made arguments about safety hazards difficult to sustain. "Mr. Morrison," said a woman I hadn't heard speak before, "we're not trying to cause trouble. We just want to enjoy our homes without constant noise." "I understand that concern," I replied, appreciating her more reasonable tone. "But my sons ride for maybe 2 hours on weekend mornings, during times when noise ordinances specifically permits, recreational activities. They're not riding at night, they're not operating on your property, and they're not exceeding legal sound limits." "How do we know they're not exceeding sound limits?" Mrs. Hutchinson interjected. "Because no one has measured them. If you're genuinely concerned about noise levels, you can purchase a decibel meter and take measurements at the property boundary during their riding times. If those measurements exceed the limits specified in county ordinances, then you have grounds for a legitimate complaint. We shouldn't have to buy equipment to prove violations." "You're right, you shouldn't. But you also shouldn't file complaints based on assumptions rather than evidence." The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, with various members of the group expressing concerns, and me trying to explain both their rights and a legal framework that governed rural property use. By the end of the discussion, it was clear that most of the group had been operating on incomplete information and misunderstanding about applicable laws. Mrs. Hutchinson, however, remained unmoved by legal explanations or reasonable discussion. "This isn't over," she said as the group prepared to leave. "We have rights, and we're going to make sure those rights are respected. Mrs. Hutchinson, your rights are already protected by county ordinances and state law. What you don't have is the right to control legal activities on other people's property." As the group walked back toward the development, I reflected on the conversation and its likely consequences. I'd provided accurate information about applicable laws and ordinances. I'd explained the objective standards that would need to be met for valid complaints. And I'd tried to distinguish between legitimate concerns and unreasonable demands. Most of the group seemed to understand and accept the legal reality of the situation. Mrs. Hutchinson, however, appeared determined to continue her campaign regardless of its legal merits. That evening, I received a phone call from Sheriff Patterson. "Caleb, I just got an interesting call from a reporter at the county newspaper. Apparently, someone contacted them about conflicts between county commissioners and HOA residents over ATV regulations." "Let me guess, Mrs. Hutchinson?" The reporter wouldn't say, but the timing seems pretty coincidental. "They're asking about your son's ATV riding and whether there are any ongoing investigations or violations." "What did you tell them?" "I told them that we investigate all complaints filed with our department, that no violations were found in this case, and that the activity in question appears to be legal recreational use of private property." "That's accurate." It is, but I wanted to give you a heads up that this might become more public than either of us anticipated. I thanked Sheriff Patterson for the warning and spent the evening thinking about the implications of media attention. On one hand, public discussion of rural property rights and county ordinances could be beneficial for community education. On the other hand, turning a neighbor dispute into a media circus rarely helped anyone involved. Next morning, I received a call from Jessica Chen, the reporter who had contacted Sheriff Patterson. Commissioner Morrison, I'm working on a story about conflicts between rural property owners and HOA residents in our county. Would you be willing to comment? I'd be happy to discuss county ordinances and property rights in general terms, I replied, but I'd prefer not to comment on specific disputes or individual complaints. Can you explain the legal framework that applies to recreational vehicle use on private property? I spent 20 minutes explaining county ordinances, noise regulations, and the distinction between HOA authority and county jurisdiction. Jessica asked thoughtful questions and seemed genuinely interested in understanding the legal and policy issues rather than just creating controversy. Commissioner, some residents have suggested that you have a conflict of interest because your sons ride ATVs. How do you respond to that? I respond by pointing out that exercising normal property rights doesn't create a conflict of interest. I have the same rights as any other property owner in unincorporated areas of the county, and those rights are protected by the same ordinances that protect everyone else. Do you think there's a need for clearer policies regarding recreational vehicle use? I think there's a need for better community education about existing policies. Most conflicts stem from misunderstandings about what rules actually apply rather than problems with the rules themselves. The article appeared in the following Wednesday's edition of the county newspaper. Under the headline, Rural Property Rights versus Suburban Expectations, County Addresses Neighbor Disputes. Jessica had done an excellent job presenting both sides of the issue while focusing on the legal and policy framework rather than personal conflicts. The article quoted Mrs. Hutchinson expressing concerns about noise and safety, but it also included Sheriff Patterson's statement that no violations had been found and my explanation of applicable ordinances. Most importantly, it provided accurate information about county noise regulations and the process for filing legitimate complaints. The community response to the article was mixed, but generally positive. I received several calls from rural property owners thanking me for defending property rights, and a few calls from development residents asking for clarification about specific situations. Most significantly, I received a call from Tom Rodriguez, president of the County Farm Bureau. Caleb, I read Jessica Chen's article, and I think you've identified an issue that affects a lot of our members. We've been getting complaints about restrictions on agricultural activities, noise from farm equipment, and attempts to regulate traditional farming practices. What kind of restrictions? HOA residents complaining about tractors operating during planting season, objections to livestock odors, attempts to regulate the hours when farmers can work their land? It's the same pattern you're dealing with, but applied to commercial agriculture rather than recreational activities. Are you interested in participating in our community education program? Absolutely. I think we need to make it clear that rural areas operate under different rules than suburban neighborhoods, and that people who choose to live in rural areas need to understand and accept those differences. COM's involvement added an important dimension to our community education efforts. Agricultural activities were specifically protected by state law and county ordinances, and farmers had both legal rights and economic necessities that couldn't be compromised by suburban-style restrictions. We scheduled a series of community meetings for the following month, with presentations from the County Commission, the Sheriff's Department, the County Attorney's Office, and the Farm Bureau. The meetings would cover rural property rights, noise regulations, agricultural protections, and the proper procedures for filing complaints about actual violations. 2 weeks after the newspaper article appeared, I received another call from Deputy Martinez. Commissioner, I wanted to let you know that we received another complaint about ATV activity in your area, but this one was different. Different how? The caller provided specific times, dates, and sound level measurements. They also included video documentation and a detailed description of the alleged violations. Mrs. Hutchinson? No, this was someone named Robert Chen from Whispering Pines. He seems to have done his homework. What did his measurements show? According to his documentation, ATV activity on Saturday morning reached 68 decibels measured at his property boundary, which exceeds the 55 decibel limit for residential areas during weekend morning hours. I was surprised by this information. County Ordinance 7-12 did specify a 55 decibel limit for residential areas, but it also included exemptions for recreational activities on private property and agricultural operations. I needed to review the exact language to understand how these standards applied to our situation. Deputy, did Mr. Chen's complaint address the recreational activity exemption? He argues that the exemption doesn't apply because the noise affects adjacent residential properties. He's requesting that we investigate whether the activity violates county ordinances despite occurring on private property. That's a more sophisticated legal argument than we've seen before. It is. And honestly, it raises questions that are beyond my expertise. I think this might require input from the county attorney's office. After hanging up with Deputy Martinez, I immediately called Margaret Yates to discuss the legal implications of Mr. Chen's complaint. Margaret, I need your interpretation of the recreational activity exemption in County Ordinance 7-12. What's the specific question? I explained Mr. Chen's complaint and his argument that the exemption didn't apply when recreational activities affected adjacent properties. That's an interesting legal question, Margaret said after I'd finished explaining. The ordinance language is somewhat ambiguous about how exemptions interact with decibel limits measured at property boundaries. What's your initial interpretation? I think the recreational activity exemption was intended to protect reasonable use of private property for normal recreational purposes. But it wasn't intended to override all noise restrictions, especially when activities generate sound levels that significantly exceed established limits. So, Mr. Chen might have a valid complaint? He might. But we'd need to consider several factors. Whether 68 decibels is significantly excessive for recreational ATV use, whether the measurements were taken properly and consistently, and whether the activity falls within the intended scope of the NBRAID. Recreational exemption? What's the next step? I think we need to conduct our own sound measurements to verify Mr. Chen's data. If his measurements are accurate, then we need to determine whether your son's ATV riding can be modified to comply with decibel limits while still allowing reasonable recreational use. This development changed the nature of the situation significantly. Instead of dealing with frivolous complaints based on subjective annoyance, we were now facing a legitimate legal question about the application of county ordinances to specific activities. That evening, I had a serious conversation with Jake and Cotter about the new complaint and its implications. Boys, we have a situation that's more complicated than the previous complaints. A neighbor has taken actual sound measurements that suggest your ATV riding might exceed county noise limits. Are we in trouble? Connor asked. You're not in trouble, but we need to figure out how to address this issue responsibly. What kind of measurements? Jake asked. He measured 68 decibels at his property boundary during your Saturday morning ride. County ordinances set a limit of 55 decibels for residential areas. Can we make the ATVs quieter? Connor suggested. That's one option. We could install better mufflers, modify your riding patterns to stay farther from property boundaries, or adjust the times when you ride. Or we could stop riding altogether, Jake said quietly. That's not necessary, son. We just need to find a way to enjoy your recreational activities while being good neighbors and complying with county ordinances. We spent the next hour discussing various options for addressing the noise issue. Both boys were mature about the situation and willing to make reasonable accommodations to resolve the conflict. The following day, I contacted a local ATV dealer to inquire about aftermarket mufflers and noise reduction equipment. It turned out that several TAN manufacturers made enhanced muffler systems specifically designed to reduce sound output without significantly affecting engine performance. The systems we carry can typically reduce sound levels by 10 to 15 decibels, the dealer explained. They're popular with riders who live in areas with noise restrictions or who want to be more considerate of neighbors. What about performance impacts? Minimal, especially for recreational riding. You might lose a small amount of top-end power, but most riders don't notice the difference for trail riding and general recreation. I ordered enhanced muffler systems for both ATVs, with installation scheduled for the following week. The total cost was about $800, which seemed like a reasonable investment in community relations and legal compliance. While we were waiting for the muffler installation, I arranged for professional sound level measurements to be taken during the boys' next riding session. I wanted objective data about current noise levels and verification of Mr. Chen's measurements before making any policy decisions. The sound engineer I hired, David Park, had experience with environmental noise assessments and legal compliance measurements. He brought calibrated equipment and took readings from multiple locations around our property boundary. Your neighbor's measurements were accurate, David reported after completing his assessment. I recorded peak levels of 66 to 70 decibels at various boundary points, with sustained levels in the 60 to 64 decibel range. Is that considered excessive for recreational ATV use? It's higher than residential noise limits, but it's not unusual for recreational vehicles. The question is whether county ordinances allow exemptions for this type of activity. What do you recommend? Install better mufflers, modify riding patterns to stay farther from property boundaries during peak noise times, and consider limiting riding to specific hours when higher noise levels might tinture. Be more acceptable. David's recommendations aligned with the approach Jake, Connor, and I had already decided to take. We would install enhanced mufflers, modify trail routes to maintain greater distances from neighboring properties, and establish more specific guidelines about riding times and duration. The following Saturday, after the new mufflers had been installed, we conducted another sound level assessment. The results were encouraging. Peak levels dropped to 52 to 56 decibels, with sustained levels in the 48 to 52 decibel range. That's a significant improvement, David reported. You're now within county noise limits for most measurements, with only occasional peaks that slightly exceed the 55 decibel threshold. Is that level of compliance reasonable for recreational activities? I think any enforcement official would consider this reasonable compliance. You've made substantial modifications to address legitimate concerns while maintaining your right to reasonable recreational use of your property. I was satisfied with these results and hoped they would resolve the conflict with our neighbors. The boys were also pleased that they could continue riding while being more considerate of the surrounding community. However, 2 days later, I received another call from Deputy Martinez. Commissioner, I have some concerning news about the ATV complaint situation. What's happened? Mrs. Hutchinson has filed a formal petition with the county requesting a complete ban on off-road vehicles in unincorporated areas of the county. She's collected signatures from 43 residents of Whispering Pines and is demanding that the county commission address this issue at your next public meeting. This escalation was both predictable and problematic. Mrs. Hutchinson had moved beyond individual complaints to seeking policy changes that would affect all rural property owners in the county. Deputy, does the petition include any legal justification for such a ban? It claims that off-road vehicles pose safety hazards, create noise pollution, cause environmental damage, and reduce property values in residential areas. Those are serious allegations. Do they include any evidence to support those claims? Not specific evidence, but they do reference general concerns about safety and quality of life. What's the next step? According to county procedures, the petition has to be considered at your next regular commission meeting. You'll need to decide whether to place it on the agenda for public discussion. I thanked Deputy Martinez and immediately called the other 2 county commissioners to discuss the situation. Both Linda Thompson and Roger Hayes were experienced rural advocates who understood the bonner implications of Mrs. Hutchinson's petition. Caleb, this sounds like an attempt to use county government to enforce suburban standards in rural areas, Linda said during our conference call. That's exactly what it is, I agreed. But we need to take it seriously, because it raises legitimate policy questions about balancing individual property rights with community standards. What kind of policy questions? Roger asked. Questions about whether current noise ordinances are adequate, whether recreational vehicle use should be subject to additional restrictions, and how we balance the rights of existing rural residents with the expectations of newcomers from suburban areas. How do you want to handle the commission meeting? I think we should place the petition on the agenda, allow public comment from both sides, and then discuss the legal and policy framework that applies to this issue. Are you planning to recuse yourself? No. I've consulted with the county attorney, and there's no conflict of interest that would require recusal. I have the same property rights as any other rural resident, and I'm not seeking special treatment for my situation. The commission meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday evening. I spent the intervening days preparing materials about recreational vehicle regulations, noise ordinances, and property rights in rural areas. I also contacted Tom Rodriguez at the Farm Bureau, Sheriff Patterson, and several rural property owners to make sure they were aware of the meeting and the issues that would be discussed. This petition affects everyone who owns rural property, I explained to each person I called. If the county starts restricting legal recreational activities based on complaints from HOA residents, it sets a precedent that could affect farming operations, hunting, fishing, and other traditional rural activities. The response was immediate and strong. Tom Rodriguez organized a group of Farm Bureau members to attend the meeting. Sheriff Patterson agreed to present information about noise complaints and enforcement procedures. Several rural property owners confirmed they would attend to speak about their concerns. On Thursday evening, the County Commission meeting room was packed with residents from both rural areas and suburban developments. Mrs. Hutchinson sat in the front row with a group of supporters from Whispering Pines, while rural residents and Farm Bureau members filled most of the remaining seats. I opened the meeting by explaining the purpose of the discussion and the legal framework that would guide our deliberations. Tonight we're considering a petition requesting restrictions on off-road vehicle use in unincorporated areas of the county. Before we hear public comments, I want to clarify the legal and policy context for this discussion. I explained county noise ordinances, property rights in rural areas, and the distinction between individual complaints about specific violations and requests for general policy changes. The question before us tonight is not whether any individual has violated existing ordinances, but whether existing ordinances provide adequate protection for all residents while preserving traditional rural property rights. Mrs. Hutchinson was the first person to speak during the public comment period. Commissioners, we're not asking for unreasonable restrictions. We're simply asking for the same peace and quiet that residents in other areas of the county enjoy. Off-road vehicles create noise pollution, safety hazards, and environmental damage that affects entire neighborhoods." End quote. She presented her petition with 43 signatures and read several written statements from residents describing noise disturbances and safety concerns. We've tried to resolve these issues through direct communication with property owners, but we've been told that our concerns don't matter because the activities occur on private property. That's not acceptable in a civilized community. When Mrs. Hutchinson finished, Tom Rodriguez stood to respond. Commissioners, I represent over 200 farm families in this county, and we're deeply concerned about this petition. The precedent of restricting legal activities on private property based on complaints from neighboring developments threatens the foundation of rural property rights. Tom explained how similar restrictions could affect agricultural operations, seasonal farming activities, and traditional rural practices. If we allow HOA residents to dictate what activities can occur on rural property, we're essentially giving suburban developments veto power over rural land use. That's not consistent with the agricultural heritage and rural character of our county. Several other speakers followed, representing both sides of the issue. Rural property owners emphasized property rights and traditional rural activities. Development residents focused on quality of life and reasonable noise restrictions. After 4 to 5 minutes of public comment, I asked Sheriff Patterson to present information about noise complaints and enforcement procedures. Over the past 2 months, our department has received 7 complaints related to off-road vehicle use in the area in question. Of those 7 complaints, 2 were determined to involve potential violations of county ordinances. In both cases, property owners took voluntary steps to address the concerns and achieve compliance. Sheriff, Does your department recommend any changes to current enforcement procedures? No, Commissioner. Current ordinances provide adequate standards for addressing legitimate noise concerns while protecting property rights. The key is education and communication rather than additional restrictions. Margaret Yates then explained the legal framework governing recreational vehicle use and noise regulations. County ordinances already provide mechanisms for addressing excessive noise, safety violations, and environmental damage. Additional restrictions would need to be justified by evidence of problems that can't be addressed through existing regulations. End quote. After all the presentations and public comments, the Commission discussed the policy options available. Linda Thompson spoke first. I don't see evidence that current ordinances are inadequate or that additional restrictions are necessary. What I do see is a need for better communication and education about existing rules and procedures. Roger Hayes agreed. This appears to be a conflict between different expectations about rural living rather than a failure of current policies. The solution is education and reasonable accommodation, not new restrictions. When it was my turn to speak, I summarized the key issues and the Commission's options. We have three basic choices tonight. We can adopt new restrictions on recreational vehicle use, we can maintain current ordinances while improving education and enforcement, or we can modify existing ordinances to provide clearer guidance about noise standards and exemptions. I recommend the second option. Current ordinances provide adequate protection when properly understood and applied. What we need is better community education about rural property rights, clearer procedures for filing legitimate complaints, and continued dialogue between different groups of residents. End quote. The Commission voted unanimously to maintain current ordinances while directing county staff to develop enhanced community education programs and clearer enforcement procedures. Mrs. Hutchinson was visibly disappointed by the decision, but several other development residents seemed satisfied that their concerns had been heard and addressed through the formal process. After the meeting, I spoke briefly with Mrs. Hutchinson and several of her supporters. Mrs. Hutchinson, I understand your concerns about noise and quality of life. I hope you'll participate in our community education program and work with us to find reasonable solutions that respect Denina. Everyone's rights. Mr. Morrison, you've made your position clear. But this issue isn't going away. We have rights too, and we're going to continue advocating for those rights. You absolutely have rights, and those rights are protected by county ordinances and state law. What you don't have is the right to control legal activities on other people's property. Over the following weeks, the situation gradually settled into a new equilibrium. Jake and Connor continued riding their ATVs with the enhanced mufflers and modified trail routes. Noise levels remained within county limits, and no additional complaints were filed. The community education program we developed proved popular and effective. We held meetings in 3 different areas of the county, with good attendance from both rural and suburban residents. The focus on factual information about ordinances and procedures helped reduce misunderstandings and prevented similar conflicts in other areas. Mrs. Hutchinson never fully accepted the outcome, but she stopped filing complaints and turned her attention to other community issues. Several other Whispering Pines residents participated in the education program and developed better relationships with their rural neighbors. Most importantly, the precedent we established protected property rights for all rural residents while acknowledging the legitimate concerns of people who chose to live in rural areas without fully understanding the implications of that choice. 6 months later, I received a call from a county commissioner in a neighboring area who was dealing with similar conflicts. Caleb, I heard about your approach to rural property rights and HOA conflicts. Would you be willing to share your community education materials and policy framework? Absolutely. These issues are becoming more common as suburban development expands into rural areas. The key is maintaining the balance between individual property rights and reasonable community standards. What's the most important lesson you learned? That most conflicts stem from misunderstandings rather than genuine policy problems. When people understand their rights and responsibilities under existing laws, most disputes resolve themselves. As I reflected on the entire experience, I realized that being a county commissioner had given me unique insights into both the challenges and opportunities of local government. The intersection of personal experience and public responsibility had been complicated, but it had also provided valuable perspective on the importance of defending fundamental rights while building CA. Community consensus. Jake and Connor, now 17 and 15, had learned important lessons about responsibility, community relations, and the importance of standing up for principles while being respectful of others. They continued riding their ATVs every weekend, but they also understood that freedom came with obligations to be considerate neighbors and responsible citizens. The 43 acres of pasture and woodland that had started this entire conflict remained exactly what they'd always been. A place where young people could learn independence, responsibility, and the satisfaction that comes from taking care of your own land and your own equipment. No amount of suburban expectations or HOA demands could change that fundamental reality. And sometimes, when I heard the sound of those ATV engines warming up on Saturday mornings, I smiled and remembered that being the boss of the person who signs the sheriff's paychecks has its advantages. Especially when you're right about the law and determined to protect the rights that make rural living worthwhile.